Broken Armor is a retro arcade-style RPG developed by Jonathan Tyndall and published by Wastebasket Games. Please support the release of the game and its DLC on Steam and in the link in the description of the video. Thank you. The plot of the game is quite simple. You're a knight who has been exiled from your kingdom on a quest to find the Holy Grail to earn the right to return home. This video is a strategy guide, information tutorial, and display of the game as it is and how you can have the most fun with its simple glory. Playable characters. Standardly, in the game, you play as the knight. However, the game has a DLC, which in my opinion makes it much more fun. The wizard. Each of these characters have 4 unique attacks. This is the only difference between the two. Each of them have the same walk speed and 100 hit points when the game begins. The controls for each of these characters are the arrow to move, left, right, up, and down, and A, S, Z, and X for each respective attack. Firstly, the knight's attacks, which are A for axe, S for spear, Z for sword, and X for mace. The axe throws a single projectile that can hit multiple enemies by phasing through anyone it comes into contact with until it hits a piece of the environment. Its projectile path is straight in the direction it is thrown. The spear throws a single projectile that disappears after hitting and doing damage to a single enemy, the first it comes in contact with. The sword works identical to the spear, and the mace works identical to the axe. The wizard also has 4 attacks with the same control scheme as the knight. These attacks are A for fireball, S for healing, Z for dagger, and X for lightning. The fireball shoots 3 projectiles that spread off from the player, one going straight in the direction the player is facing, one going to the top, and one going to the bottom, as you can see on screen. When healing, the player will recover 25 lost hit points, maxing out at a total of 100 hit points. The dagger shoots a single projectile straight in the direction the player is facing that disappears after the first enemy it comes in contact with. It works exactly the same as the spear and the sword from the knight's control scheme. Lightning shoots a single projectile in the direction the player is facing that can hit multiple enemies by traveling through them. Lightning works identical to the axe and the mace. You can only have 5 of each item before the game stops allowing you to gain more. Once you have 5 of an item, if you walk over that item in the environment to try and pick it up, it will do nothing. Environments. There are 3 biomes in the game with slightly different layouts, though I think the majority of the changes in each biome are mostly aesthetic. Mobs and where they spawn will be discussed in their own section of this video, but for the time being they will be ignored. This section will solely focus on the environment as it stands. I would also like to disclaim that while this list says certain environmental aspects can only be found in certain areas, that is not true. In rare cases, some of the different environments can be found in earlier areas. This list only talks about common spawns. Firstly, the dungeon, which is shown on screen now. Hints of other biomes can sometimes generate in the dungeon as a whole, but the main points of discussion here are the randomly generating water and poison lakes. Water is the most common environmental change one will see in this area, which slows the player down when walked through, but can be used as a shield against certain mobs as they cannot enter it. The poison lakes will be much less common in this area, but when entered, will damage the player and inflict poison status effects on them that will dissipate fairly quickly once the player exits the poison lake. The second biome the player will encounter is the forest, shown on screen once again. The forest is very similar to the dungeon, shy a few different mobs. Water is more common, as are poison lakes, and the occasional blood lake. Blood lakes will give you a damage status effect when entered that is a bit quicker than the poison effect, but acts much the same physically. And the third biome is the dead forest, the hardest biome in the game. Water seemingly no longer spawns, and blood and poison lakes are what you'll commonly encounter here, as well as the full onslaught of enemies the game has to offer. Other than that, not too much different from the forest. Technically, the last biome is the end sequence. I will not show it as to not spoil anything in the game, but it is a conglomerate of all the previous biome mixed into a maze dungeon-esque area, but I'll let you find that out for yourself. I totally forgot to add the fourth biome, which takes place before the last one mentioned and after the dark forest. It's essentially just the dark dungeon, all of the qualities of the dark forest, but with a different wall texture and shit. I'll put it up on screen now and you'll see it later in the video. Items and coins. Coins give the player a small amount of score and currency to spend at the shop. The bronze coin gives the player 10 score and 1 currency. It is the most common coin in the game. The silver coin gives the player 50 score and 5 currency. It's fairly common but rarer than bronze coins. The gold coin gives the player 100 score and 10 currency. It is the most rare coin in the game and will not be commonly seen. The only other item of note are hearts. Hearts seem to be in a rarity between silver and gold coins, and I found them to be slightly more common as mob drops. When picked up, they will heal the player 25 hit points up to 100. If the player has 100 hit points, they will do nothing. The shop. The shop appears before every boss. It allows you to spend coins to get any item in the game at seemingly random. Despite my multiple playthroughs, I couldn't seem to find a pattern with the prices of the items, and when the items appeared, leading me to believe that it is completely RNG. I will, however, personally note that I found the shop pretty much useless, more so as the mage than the knight. When generally playing, it's pretty easy to come across the weapons needed to keep fighting, and boss levels are more than generous enough to give you the weapons you need to continue during the fight. I will say, when playing as the knight, buying hearts at the shop can be very useful. However, the wizard and its healing ability gives absolutely no reason to make shop purchases. That all said, I would save or try to save gained currency to stock up for the final boss, which will be discussed later in the guide. Mobs. Mobs are the basic enemies that you're going to encounter throughout each biome in the game. The mobs in the game stack, so you can encounter any mobs that you've seen from the beginning all the way until the end of the game. When the player comes into contact with the mobs, they will be rapidly damaged until they move away from the mob. A handful of mobs will leave status effects, and some have projectile attacks, but your main concern is coming into contact. Mobs in the dungeon. Spider. The spider walks at a relatively slow pace and leaves a trail of webs behind it at random. The webs, when walked through, slow the player for the entire time they're in the web, and for a very small amount of time after they exit the web. Blue slime. The blue slime walks at a relatively normal pace with the player. It shoots out blue projectiles at the player that have a fairly normal range and will damage the player on contact. It also follows the player around more viciously than any other mob in the game. Lizard. The lizard moves at a very fast pace and seems to lightly chase the player within a short radius. Snake. The snake also moves at a relatively fast pace, slower than the lizard, but much faster than the player. Bat. The bat is the fastest moving mob in the game. It also has the ability to fly over any environmental obstacles that might be in its way. Mobs in the forest. Green slime. The green slime acts the same as the blue slime, except running into it and projectiles it shoots will inflict poison on the player, causing them to slowly lose health for the duration of the status effect. Mobs in the dead forest. The red bat. The red bat, or vampire bat, works the same as the regular bat, except running into it inflicts a much faster poison effect than the green poison effect. Red slime. The red slime acts the same as the blue and green slime with the damage effect of the vampire bat. Bosses. And without further ado, what you all came for, the bosses. Before I get into the specific bosses, I will detail some general boss facts. Some of these will be repeated from other parts of the video. A max of one weapon per boss spawns in the boss dungeon, meaning once you have one or more of a weapon, another will not spawn until you use the one you have. The bosses all spawn in a completely random order for every different playthrough, with the exception of the final boss, the Black Knight. The map the bosses are in does not change more than texturally per playthrough, meaning you can expect the same environment from each boss when you get to it. Finally, there will always be a shop immediately before each boss. I have ordered this list from my personal opinion on the least difficult to the most difficult bosses in the game. Tree. The tree is a stationary boss, a large tree surrounded by poison water. This boss is unique as it will not actually attack the player by itself. It will, however, spawn a maximum of 3 green slimes that will attack the player on its behalf. The tree has 10 hit points. Honestly, I find this boss very easy to defeat. I recommend, if playing as the knight, dedicating your mace and axe attack to killing the green slimes and using the other 2 to target the boss. Try to do as much direct damage to the tree as possible to minimize the amount of slimes that can spawn, since without the slimes, it has no way of damaging you. If you play as the wizard, save your fireball attack for the slimes and use the other 2 to deal damage directly to the tree. Snake. This boss is a modified, bigger version of the snake mob that spawns in the game. It will follow the player around, trying to come into contact with them to deal rapid damage, but other than that, it's pretty harmless. It moves just a little slower than the player, so you can be a bit loose with your movements around the map. The snake has 7 hit points. I found the best way to defeat this boss is to wait until you have one of each weapon. Get the snake all the way on either the right or left side of the map, then quickly turn around and unleash all of your saved weapons on it before it can make contact with you. Rinse and repeat until it's defeated. Big Slime. This boss is essentially just a bigger version of the slime enemy. More health and a slightly more powerful attack. The boss moves at a moderate pace around the map and shoots one large projectile at the player that fizzes with smaller projectiles until it eventually dissipates. The Big Slime has 10 hit points. I found the best way to defeat this boss is to move up and down, side to side, and train the slime to stay towards the middle of the map, giving you plenty of room to avoid its attacks and stay out of contact with it. Giant Eye. This boss, as the name would imply, is one giant eye that takes up half the screen, and 2 red slimes that spawn besides it. This boss is completely stationary and will never approach the player or move in any way. It will rapidly shoot red tears at the player that will deal a moderate amount of damage, which can build up quickly. The giant eye has 12 hit points. I found the best way to defeat this boss is, funnily enough, to move as much as possible. Prioritize killing the slimes first, as I think they have the most potential to deal damage to the player, then utilize the highlighted covering points to keep moving back and forth across the map, making sure not to let the boss's attack come in contact with you, which can be done by getting a feel for the gap in the tiers it rapidly attacks you with. This boss takes a little bit to get used to, but once you get a feel for it, I find it pretty easy to take down personally. Vampire Bat. This boss is 2 enemies, almost entirely the same as the red bat that can be encountered in the base world of the game, accompanied by 4 black bats. All of these enemies will fly randomly around the map, trying to run into the player to deal damage. The black bats each have 1 hit point, and the vampire bats have 2 hit points each. I found the best way to defeat this boss is to try your best to come in with as much firepower as you can. Right out of the gate, you're going to want to focus on the black bats to take out as many of them as you can before they overwhelm you. They only have 1 HP, so they should be relatively easy to take out if you're accurate with your shots. After the black bats are removed, stay as mobile as you can and chip away at the vampire bats until they are taken care of. Dual Eyes. This boss is 2 eyes that will pop out of sockets in the ground. They will each fire a line of red tears at the player that will damage you upon contact. These eyes will each float around the map, staying relatively close to each other despite having different paths, and if the player touches the eyes themselves, they will rapidly take damage, as with all the enemies in the game. Each of the eyes has 5 hit points for a total of 10 health for the entire boss fight. For defeating this boss, I personally suggest trying to focus your attacks on one individual eye and keep your distance from the boss itself to give you time to avoid its attacks and prevent accidentally running into the boss. This boss makes it very easy to get pinned into a corner while trying to take cover, which is a death sentence. The only part of the map that is dangerous for the player to step on are the green poison lakes. The sockets the eyes came out of, despite leaving a black hole-looking texture in the ground, will do nothing when walked on. I find trying to make circles around the entire map as best as you can and trying to get the two eyes to stay relatively close to each other so they don't take up too much space for you to maneuver around while attacking and dodging is the best way to defeat this boss. Skeleton. The skeleton is a large skeleton, obviously, that will throw bones and charge at the player. This boss can be surprisingly difficult to defeat even once you have a feel for it, as it has something of an unpredictable nature to it. Standardly, this boss moves quite slow. However, at seemingly random times, it will charge at the player and will move much faster than you can. Its other attack is to throw a spread of bones at the player that will deal damage upon contact. The skeleton has 10 hit points. I found the best way to defeat this boss is to stay as far away as possible. While you may get hit by some of the bones it throws, steering clear of its rush attack is your best bet when trying to defeat the boss, as that can range from draining your health to almost nothing instantly or killing you with how quickly it deals damage. It typically runs in a linear path when it does charge and stays in one area of the map, so it's easy to get distance from the boss if you can think just a little faster than it and clear its path. The Black Knight. This boss will always be the final boss of the game. It has 12 hit points. You know you're at this boss if you get to a boss room that appears to have no boss in it, and just 3 red slimes. If you know this boss is coming, it may be a good idea to stock up weapons at the shop before entering, as you don't want to have to try and scramble for weapons after the boss is already out, if you don't have to. To do this, I recommend counting up the bosses. This boss will always be the 8th boss, meaning it's always the 8th shop. So when you get to the 8th shop, you know to prepare for it. If you don't buy weapons going in, kill all but one of the red slimes until you can get the max of each weapon that will spawn in the boss map naturally. For this boss, you're going to want to defeat the slimes in a way that leaves you in the bottom middle of the screen. I recommend saving the last slime until you have one of each weapon, as I've said. If you have 0 of a weapon, it will spawn somewhere in the map if you wait for it. The large brick formation in the middle top of the screen is where the boss is going to appear when all the slimes are defeated. The boss takes up a large portion of the player's movable space, and it will destroy any of the structure it walks through. The Black Knight loosely follows the player around the map, trying to either run into them or hit the player with any of its throwable attacks. The Black Knight's attacks are the same as the Knight playable characters, but scaled up. The weapons it throws will also destroy the pieces of environment they come into contact with. It is best to try and take cover as to not get hit by the throwables or the boss moving. Honestly, the most difficult part about this boss is the unexpected nature of it. But after defeating the slimes, if you stay towards the bottom of the screen and move one step ahead of where the boss wants to go, you can get a feel for its pace and train it around the screen, using its want to follow you against it to keep yourself covered from all of its attacks. I would also like to note that I've found this boss to heavily favor being on the right-hand side of the map, although I'm not sure if it's just something I experienced or if it's how the boss itself functions. Fittingly, I find this boss to be the most difficult in the game by far. All of its attacks can range from moving quite slow to quite fast towards the player, and it can be generally very difficult to avoid, as well as very difficult to find cover as it destroys the pieces of the map that it runs into. Just remember, again, when trying to defeat the Black Knight, that your best bet is to use the Knight's light want to follow the player around an undestroyed environment to cover yourself and take this boss out swiftly and efficiently. Take your time and be patient with your attacks, and you'll have this boss defeated with minimal trouble. While that is the last boss in the game, your fight isn't quite over yet. I heavily suggest, if you can, trying to keep most of your health intact after the Black Knight. I will not detail the end sequence of the game as not to spoil it once again. You're going to need some health going into it. I find it's manageable to get through without having any weapons, but it may not be a bad idea to have 1 or 2 if you can manage after the Black Knight. RNG. Much of the game is RNG, which means that the spawns of pretty much everything from the map to the items are inconsistent. The bosses, with the exception of the final boss, can spawn in any order, and every playthrough seems to be quite unique. The shop's items and prices, the enemies in each map, the maps themselves, everything is randomly generated from a finite amount of random maps and spawns. That said, if you are skilled at the game and play a few times, this does not affect how well you can progress. General strategy and other notes. From my experience, there are two ways you can play the game, both having their own strategy. This section will also detail some minor pointers I found while playing the game personally. You can either play the game for speed or score. Playing for speed, you're going to want to try to avoid enemies as much as possible. Prioritize getting to the next area and eventually the boss more than killing the enemies in front of you. For this way of play, you're only going to want to kill enemies when you absolutely need to progress. The only items you're going to want to collect when playing for speed are weapons generally. Coins shouldn't matter, though you should get some in case you need to buy hearts and stock for the final boss if you feel the need to do so. Playing for score, you're going to want to do the exact opposite. You're going to want to kill as much as you can, taking it nice and slow. Collect all the items you see, and don't worry too much about using all your weapons. As I've detailed before, getting replacements should be fairly easy. Take your time to get as many points and coins as you can as efficiently as possible. Farming. Unfortunately, much of the farming has been removed from the game. The only farming strategy I've found in the game since recent updates is farming weapons on the bosses you find easier. You can get one of each weapon at the boss if you wait for them to spawn before defeating the boss. As far as getting points, it seems like the best way is to take your playthrough slow, kill as many basic mobs as you can, and brute force your way to whatever score you seek to achieve. Hopefully not 250,000. Achievements. This game has 22 achievements. Most of them, however, are fairly easy to get just by playing the game. There's an achievement for simply dying, which is as easy as just dying. There's also an achievement for dying 10 times, which is only 10 times harder than the aforementioned achievement. And there's a final death achievement for dying 25 times, which is 25 times harder than the first one. Third time's the charm. The next 8 achievements are for defeating each individual boss in the game. There is an achievement for completing the game. The next 3 achievements are for getting 10k, 25k, and 50k points. Details on how to get points were touched on before and throughout the video. The next 3 achievements are for getting 100, 500, and 1,000 coins. The best way to get this is simply by collecting coins and spending absolutely nothing while playing. And the last 4 achievements are for collecting 5 of each item in the game. That would be 5 swords/daggers, 5 maces/lightning, 5 spears/healing, and 5 axes/fire. Keeping them all on your person at the same time will gain you the achievement. So a little more than 2 years after I posted my How to Reach 250k and Beyond achievement guide for an achievement that is now no longer in the game, and a few months after the achievement itself was removed, as far as I can tell, I've come back for revenge in the form of a full achievement guide. I hope this video or the tutorial I've posted on my Steam account will help you in your journey to find the Holy Grail and return to the unnamed kingdom you've come from. And don't forget the best advice about the game: don't die.